He was 18 years old when the world shrank to the size of what he could carry in his own 2 hands. The morning air was a blade, sharp and indifferent, carving steam from his breath. It was the kind of cold that felt ancient, a cold that seeped through wool and skin to find the bone. His father stood in the doorway of the sod-roofed cabin, a silhouette against the meager warmth inside, his frame thick with a bitterness that had been fermenting for years. In his hand, the man held a half-empty bottle. In his voice, he held the final verdict. "Take your book and your foolish notions and get out," Garrett slurred, the words thick but the meaning clear as ice. "I'll not have a son who dreams in the dirt instead of working it." The book was a small, leather-bound volume on geology and soil composition, a gift from his mother before the sickness took her. It was his only real inheritance. The other was a quiet, observant nature that his father mistook for weakness. Finn looked from the book in his own hand to the fury in his father's eyes. There was no argument to be made. Arguing with Garrett was like trying to reason with a rock slide. The forces at play were too heavy, too chaotic, and all you could do was get out of the way. He was given a thin blanket, a small sack with a heel of bread and a wedge of hard cheese, and the clothes on his back. The door shut behind him with a sound of utter finality. The click of the latch was an earthquake, shearing his life in two. Before and after. He stood there for a long moment, the colder physical weight on his shoulders, and looked out over the bleak, frost-hardened landscape of the territory. The ground was his father's enemy, a stubborn adversary to be broken by the plow each spring. But for Finn, it was a text, a language. He understood its layers, its strengths, its hidden logic. It was this understanding, this quiet communion with the earth, that had become an unforgivable sin. The town of Redemption, a mile down the rutted track, was no refuge. They were his father's people, men who measured worth in calluses and sweat, who saw thinking as a form of idleness. They saw his sketching of watercourses and his testing of soil between his fingers as the strange habits of a boy not long for this world. He was an outlier, a deviation from the hard-bitten norm, and the frontier had little patience for such things. He turned his back on the cabin, the only home he had ever known, and walked not toward the town, but away from it, following the frozen creek that snaked its way through the low hills. His destination was a place of forgetting, a monument to failure that everyone else in Redemption ignored, the old grist mill. It stood skeletal and broken, its great water wheel frozen solid, its stones covered in a patina of moss and time. It was a place where ambition had died, and that, he thought with a flicker of grim irony, made it the perfect place to start again. He had nothing left to lose but the heat in his own body. Finn's fascination with the earth had been nurtured in secret, a quiet rebellion against his father's rigid worldview. His mother, a woman with a gentle spirit and a surprisingly keen mind, had been the one to plant the seed. She had taught him not just the names of the prairie grasses and the birds, but the reasons for their existence. She showed him how the cottonwoods grew only where the water table was high, how the color of the soil could tell you what would thrive and what would wither. "Everything has a reason for being where it is, Finn," she would say, her voice soft as milkweed fluff. The land tells a story. If you're patient enough to listen. After she was gone, the listening became his only solace. While other boys were learning the brute force of the axe and the plow, Finn was learning the subtle architecture of the world. He'd spend hours tracing the lines of sedimentary rock in a creek bed, crumbling different types of soil in his palm, feeling the grit of sand, the silk of clay, the richness of loam. He learned that the ground was not a single, solid thing. It was a layered history, a complex system of support and drainage, of insulation and vulnerability. His father saw only a surface to be conquered. Finn saw a sanctuary to be understood. Garrett's grief had curdled into a hard, resentful anger, aimed at the world but often landing on his son. The boy's quiet intensity was a constant, unnerving reminder of the wife he had lost. She had that same contemplative stillness. He saw her ghost in Finn's focused gaze, and he hated it. He tried to beat it out of him, to force him into the mold of a loud, thoughtless laborer. A man works with his back, not his nose in a book, he'd roar, his frustration echoing across their small, struggling plot of land. But Finn's nature was not something that could be broken. It was like water, it simply found another path. He learned to do his chores with a detached efficiency, his mind elsewhere, pondering the mechanics of a natural spring or the insulating properties of packed earth. The book on geology, purchased from a traveling peddler with coins his mother had secretly saved for him, became his Bible. It gave names and principles to the things he instinctively knew. It spoke of thermal mass, of how the deep earth maintains a constant temperature, indifferent to the scorching sun of summer or the killing frosts of winter. While his father saw the ground as a dead thing, Finn was reading about a living system, a source of stability in a world that offered none. This silent, intellectual pursuit was the ultimate betrayal in Garrett's eyes. It was a rejection of his way of life, of the only wisdom he possessed, the wisdom of sweat and strain. The final confrontation hadn't been sudden, it was the culmination of 1,000 small resentments, a pressure that had been building for years until the container of their shared grief could no longer hold it. The final rupture had been over something small, almost laughable. A patch of garden near the cabin had been failing for years, yielding only stunted, bitter vegetables. Garrett blamed the soil, the weather, God. He attacked it with the same brute force every season, plowing it deeper, cursing its barrenness. That fall, Finn had spent 2 weeks quietly amending the soil in a small, forgotten corner behind the woodshed. He'd carried richer loam from the creek bed, mixed in composted leaves, and built a low stone wall on the north side to capture the sun's warmth. He wasn't trying to prove his father wrong, he was simply compelled by an inner need to solve the puzzle, to bring a small piece of the world into balance. He had managed to coax a late-season crop of hardy greens from the revitalized patch. They were small but vibrant, a splash of impossible life against the browning landscape. When Garrett discovered it, he wasn't proud. He was incandescent with rage. He saw it not as a gift, but as an accusation. A silent judgment on his own failures. "You think you're better than me," he had roared, his shadow falling over the small, green leaves. "You think your dirt muttering is worth more than my sweat." He had taken his boot and systematically crushed every single plant, grinding the leaves into the very soil that had nourished them. The act was so senseless, so purely destructive, that something inside Finn finally hardened. He had said nothing, merely watched the pointless violence unfold. That night, Garrett drank more than usual. The next morning, he found Finn not mending a fence, but sitting on a rock, cleaning the dirt from the pages of his geology book. That was the final spark. The sight of the book, the symbol of his son's quiet defiance, was too much to bear. And so Finn was cast out, walking away from the ruin of his father's making, the ghost of his mother's wisdom his only guide. He arrived at the old mill as dusk began to bleed across the sky. The structure groaned in the wind, a lonely sound. It was built on a stone foundation, set deep into the bank of the creek. The location was no accident, the original builders had chosen it for its stability. Finn ran his hand over the cold, massive foundation stones. This was a place to start. He wasn't thinking about a house, not yet. He was thinking about a single, simple imperative: surviving the night. The temperature was dropping fast. He found a place where the earth had eroded beneath the foundation, creating a shallow overhang. It wasn't much, but it broke the wind. He huddled there, pulling the thin blanket around his shoulders, the geology book pressed against his chest for what little insulation it could offer. The hunger in his belly was a dull ache, but the cold was a living thing, a predator with teeth. He knew he would not survive many nights like this. The solution was not on the surface of the world, but within it. The first few days were a blur of gnawing hunger and relentless cold. Survival became a series of stark, simple calculations. He spent the daylight hours scavenging for anything edible, dried berries clinging to thorny bushes, the last of the wild onions by the creek bed. He set simple snares, and after 2 days of frustrating failure, caught a single, scrawny rabbit. He cooked it over a tiny, nearly smokeless fire of dry twigs, hidden in a hollow between the mill's foundation stones. He ate every last scrap, the hot meat a revelation in his belly. But food was only half the battle. The true enemy was the cold. Each night, it stole more of his strength, leaving him stiff and trembling by dawn. The shallow overhang was not enough. He needed to get out of the wind, out of the air itself. He needed to go down. He had no tools but his knife and his hands, until he found a flat, sharp-edged piece of shale that could serve as a rudimentary spade. He began to dig into the earth bank under the mill, expanding his small shelter. The work was brutal. The topsoil was frozen solid, and he had to chip away at it in tiny, exhausting increments. But as he dug deeper, past the frost line, the earth softened. A different smell rose from the ground, not the sterile scent of frozen dust, but the rich, damp smell of life. It was a smell of hope. He dug with a methodical desperation. He wasn't just creating a hole, he was following the logic of the land. He burrowed alongside the massive foundation stones, using their stability as his guide. After 4 days of relentless labor, he had carved out a space barely larger than a coffin, just big enough to lie down in, protected from the wind on all sides. It was claustrophobic and dark, but when he crawled inside, the difference was immediate. The air was still. The biting edge of the cold was gone, replaced by a constant, neutral chill. He had escaped the surface. For a week, this tiny burrow was his entire world. He would crawl out in the morning to check his snares and forage, and crawl back in at dusk, pulling a large, flat stone over the entrance to seal himself in. The townspeople, if they thought of him at all, likely assumed he had frozen to death or moved on. On the few occasions he saw a rider in the distance, he would flatten himself against the ground, invisible. He was a ghost haunting the ruins of the old mill. His body grew leaner, harder. His hands were raw, his nails broken, but his mind was clear, focused on the next small step. He was alive because he was listening to the earth, not fighting it. He was applying the principles from his book, not as abstract theories, but as life-saving truths. He was proving that knowledge, the very thing he was punished for, was the most practical tool of all. On the 19th day, everything changed. He was deepening his burrow, pushing further into the earth bank, when his shale spade struck something that wasn't soil or stone. It was a layer of dense, wet clay, cool and pliable. He knew from his reading that a thick vein of clay was often a barrier, trapping water beneath it. His heart began to beat faster. Water was life. He had been making treacherous trips to the creek, breaking through the ice to get a drink. A secure source would be a miracle. He began to dig carefully around the clay, following the vein as it sloped downward. It was like tracing a map to a hidden treasure. The air in the confined space grew thick with the smell of wet minerals. Then, his fingers broke through the bottom of the clay layer. It wasn't a gush of water, but a slow, steady seep. A single, clear drop welled up and fell onto his hand, cold and pure. He dug a small basin, and within an hour, it had filled with a few inches of clean, drinkable water. He wept, the first tears he'd shed since his exile. It was more than just water, it was a sign. It was the earth providing for him, rewarding his attention. But the true discovery was yet to come. As he enlarged the space around the spring, his makeshift shovel hit solid rock. Not a boulder, but a wall. He cleared the soil away and saw it was a vast, flat shelf of limestone. He followed it with his hands, tracing its surface. It formed a natural roof, sloping gently upwards as it went deeper into the hill. The soil above it was a thick layer of earth, and above that, the massive, forgotten foundation of the mill. He had stumbled upon a natural cellar, a void space perfectly engineered by geology. The air here was different. He licked his finger and held it up. There was no draft. He lit a precious match, and the flame stood perfectly still, its small light pushing back the immense darkness. He held the match near the ground, then near the limestone ceiling. The temperature felt stable. It was cool, but it wasn't the life-stealing cold of the surface. He scrambled out of his burrow and returned with a small bundle of dry grass. He lit it, creating a larger, more sustained light. The space was bigger than he thought, a low-ceiling chamber about 10 feet wide and 15 feet long, with a floor of packed earth and a ceiling of solid rock. It was a room, waiting for him. A home. This was the principle of thermal mass made real. The immense weight of the earth and stone above acted as a blanket, shielding this space from the wild temperature swings of the surface. Here, deep in the heart of the hill, the temperature would remain almost constant year-round. He knew, from his book, that it would likely hover around 55 degrees. Cool in the summer, but life-savingly warm in the dead of winter. He stood there in the flickering light, the smell of his spring and the ancient stone filling his lungs. His father had cast him out into the dirt. But the dirt had taken him in. It had offered him shelter, water, and warmth. It had offered him a future. The next few months were a blur of focused, backbreaking creation. Finn was no longer just surviving, he was building. The discovery of the natural chamber transformed his mindset from that of a desperate scavenger to that of a deliberate engineer. His first priority was to make the space truly his own. He spent weeks enlarging the chamber, not with reckless abandon, but with careful, calculated excavation. He learned the language of the rock, the way it fractured, the load it could bear. He used the displaced earth and stone to build up the entrance, creating a narrow, defensible tunnel that sloped down from his original burrow. He constructed a door from tightly packed sod and a large, flat stone that could be rolled into place, making his new home all but invisible from the outside. Ventilation was the next critical problem. A sealed underground space would quickly become a tomb. He needed a way to bring in fresh air and let out smoke. This was his greatest challenge. He studied the limestone ceiling for days, tapping it, listening to the sound. He finally found a place where a natural fissure ran through the rock. Using his knife and a harder stone as a hammer, he began the painstaking process of chipping away at the fissure, widening it. It took him 3 weeks of tedious, upward-straining work, but he finally broke through to the soil above. He then carefully dug a narrow shaft up to the surface, lining it with flat stones to prevent collapse. On the surface, it emerged in the middle of a dense thicket of wild thorns, a small, unassuming hole that no one would ever notice. He had his chimney. He built a small, efficient hearth against a rock wall, a masterpiece of practical design that drew smoke up the flue and radiated a surprising amount of heat into the chamber. The steady warmth changed everything. The damp chill receded, and the space became a sanctuary. Now, he could think beyond mere shelter. He needed a sustainable source of food. Foraging and snaring were unreliable. He needed to grow things. Using buckets he fashioned from cured rabbit hides, he began the laborious process of hauling the rich, dark topsoil from the creek bank down into his home. He designated one chamber, connected to his main living area, as his garden. The biggest problem was light. He solved it with ingenuity and a piece of luck. He found several sheets of mica, a translucent mineral, in a rock outcropping miles away. He spent a week carefully cutting and fitting these sheets into a small frame he made, creating a crude but effective skylight. He installed it at the top of a second, wider shaft he dug, which opened at a low angle on the sun-facing side of the hill, hidden beneath the lip of an overhang. It didn't let in direct sunlight, but it captured a significant amount of ambient light, funneling it down into his garden. It was a dim, perpetual twilight, but he calculated it would be enough for certain plants. He planted carrots first, then a hardy, shade-tolerant lettuce. The tomatoes were his biggest gamble. He planted them directly beneath the light shaft, hoping they would receive just enough energy. He acquired his livestock through a single, bold transaction. He walked 10 miles to a farm owned by a reclusive old man who was known to be fair. Finn offered 2 full days of hard labor, splitting wood until his hands bled, in exchange for 3 laying hens, a rooster, and a pregnant ewe. The old farmer, intrigued by the quiet, determined boy, agreed. Getting the animals back to the mill and down into his subterranean home was an ordeal, but he managed it. He built a small, clean pen for them in a separate, well-ventilated chamber, feeding them on stored grains he'd managed to trade for and a mash he made from vegetable scraps. The soft clucking of the chickens and the gentle bleating of the ewe were the sounds of life, of a future. The first time he ate a meal composed entirely of his own labor, a roasted carrot, a fresh egg, and a handful of crisp lettuce, cooked over his own hearth in his own home, he felt a sense of profound and unshakable ownership. He had built this world, piece by piece, out of nothing but knowledge, will, and the discarded remnants of the land. As autumn deepened, turning the prairie grasses to a brittle gold, Finn's subterranean world was thriving. His garden produced a small but steady supply of vegetables. The carrots grew sweet and deep in the rich soil, the lettuce was pale but crisp, and, to his astonishment, 2 of his tomato plants were yielding small, intensely flavored fruit. His hens were laying regularly, and his ewe had given birth to a healthy lamb. He was not living in luxury, but he was secure. He had water, food, and warmth, the 3 pillars of existence that were becoming increasingly precarious for the people on the surface. The first snows of the year were a gentle dusting, a mere hint of what was to come. For the residents of Redemption, it was a signal to check their larders, to stack their firewood higher, and to settle in for the long, lean months ahead. For Finn, it was a confirmation of his success. While the world above grew colder and more barren, his hidden sanctuary remained at a constant, life-sustaining temperature. He felt no fear of the coming winter, only a quiet sense of preparedness. He knew he couldn't remain a complete ghost forever. He needed things he couldn't make: salt, flour, a better knife, a real axe head. He decided to make a trip to the general store in Redemption. It was a risk. He would have to face the people who had scorned him, who had echoed his father's judgment. He packed a basket with his finest produce, a dozen perfect carrots, a bundle of fresh lettuce, 6 eggs, and 3 precious, red tomatoes. The sight of them, vibrant and alive in the pale November light, was almost shocking. He walked into Abernathy's Mercantile, the bell above the door announcing his arrival with a jangle that made him flinch. The store was warm, smelling of coffee, leather, and smoked meat. Abernathy, a man whose face was a permanent ledger of grim calculations, looked up from his accounts. His eyes widened slightly at the sight of Finn, whom most had written off as dead. They widened even more when he saw the contents of the basket. "Where in God's name did you get those?" Abernathy asked, his voice a low rumble of disbelief. He picked up a tomato, turning it over in his calloused fingers as if it were a jewel. Finn didn't offer an explanation. He had learned that words were often useless. He simply said, for trade Abernathy was a businessman above all else. His curiosity was eclipsed by the opportunity. Fresh produce in November was worth more than gold. People would pay a premium for a taste of summer in the dead of the year. He examined the lettuce, snapping a leaf in half. It was crisp. He grunted, a sound that passed for high praise. A small crowd had gathered in the store, their conversations falling silent as they stared at the impossible harvest. There were whispers, looks of suspicion and awe. The laughter was gone. No one laughs at a miracle. The trade was made. Finn left the store with a heavy sack containing salt, flour, a new knife, matches, and a small bag of coffee beans. He had not smiled, had not engaged in small talk. He had been a force of nature, a mystery. As he walked back toward the mill, he could feel their eyes on his back. He had proven them wrong, not with an argument, but with a fact. A simple, green, living fact. The blizzard arrived without fanfare. It began as a whisper of snow, a gentle thickening of the grey sky. But within hours, the whisper became a roar. The wind howled down from the north, a physical force that scoured the landscape and drove the snow into mountainous drifts. For 3 days, it did not cease. The world vanished beneath a sea of white. Redemption was completely cut off. The trails disappeared, the landscape was rendered unrecognizable, and an immense, profound silence fell, broken only by the shriek of the wind. Inside his subterranean home, Finn was largely untouched. He heard the storm as a distant, muffled roar, the sound of a faraway ocean. The temperature in his dwelling remained a steady 55 degrees. He tended his animals, harvested his small garden, and felt a deep, abiding sense of security. He had built his life below the fury of the world, and the world could not reach him. On the surface, however, desperation was setting in. The blizzard was not a normal storm, it was a siege. After the first week, supplies in the town began to run low. The storm had come early and with unprecedented violence, catching many unprepared. Firewood was rationed. Food became scarce. The preserved meats and dried beans held out, but the lack of anything fresh began to take its toll. Children grew listless, their parents' faces etched with a new kind of fear. A deep, gnawing anxiety settled over the town. By the third week, the first cases of scurvy appeared, bleeding gums, aching joints, a profound lethargy. The town doctor, a man of limited resources, could do little more than recommend the impossible: fresh vegetables, anything with life in it. It was Abernathy who remembered. In the dim light of his store, as he doled out dwindling rations of flour to grim-faced settlers, he recalled the basket of impossible produce. He remembered the quiet, strange boy everyone had dismissed. The story, which had been a piece of town gossip, now became a sliver of hope. He told the town council, a group of 3 grim, bearded men. They were skeptical, but they were also desperate. "It's not possible," one of them said. "Nothing can grow now." I held a tomato in my hand, Abernathy insisted. It was real. A small, desperate party was assembled. 4 men, including Abernathy, wrapped in every layer they owned, set out for the old mill. The journey was an ordeal. They struggled through chest-deep drifts, their breath freezing on their beards, the world a blinding vortex of white. They almost turned back twice. When they finally reached the mill, they saw nothing. Just snow, piled high against the ancient stones. It was Abernathy who found the ventilation hole, a small circle of melted snow in the middle of a thorn bush. They called out Finn's name, their voices swallowed by the wind. For a long time, there was no answer. Then, a flat stone rolled aside from a snow-covered bank, and a figure emerged from the ground like a spirit. Finn stood before them, clad in simple wool, unharmed by the cold. He looked at the 4 freezing men, their faces a mixture of fear, hope, and shame. He said nothing, simply held the stone door open and gestured for them to enter. They descended into the earth, one by one, leaving the howling blizzard behind. They stepped into a world of quiet warmth, of soft light, of impossible green. They saw the neat rows of vegetables, heard the clucking of chickens, smelled the rich scent of living soil. They stared in stunned, reverent silence. It wasn't a madman's hovel. It was a haven. It was life. The leader of the council, a stern man named Miller, was the first to find his voice. His words were raspy from the cold. We need your help. Our people are sick." Finn looked at the faces of the men who represented the town that had mocked him, the community that had silently consented to his exile. He saw no triumph in their desperation, only a grim reality. He had built this place for his own survival, not for theirs. Yet, here they were. He thought of his mother's words, that everything has a reason for being where it is. Perhaps this was the reason. He led them to his small pantry, a cool chamber where he had stored his surplus. There were baskets of carrots, carefully preserved greens, and a small crate of his precious tomatoes. "I have food," Finn said, his voice even. "I will trade." Abernathy nodded, understanding immediately. This was not charity. This was business. It was a transaction between equals, a fact that granted Finn more dignity than any apology could. "We have coin. We have supplies you might need when the thaw comes," Miller said quickly. "Name your price." "The price is the same for everyone," Finn replied, his gaze steady. "A fair trade. No more, no less." The men returned to Redemption with a sled laden with fresh food. It was a sight that brought tears to the eyes of the weary townspeople. The vegetables were distributed, first to the sick and the children. Within days, the effects were visible. The tide of sickness began to turn. The town had been saved, not by a hero, but by the quiet outcast they had scorned. Every few days, a party would make the difficult journey to the mill, bringing goods to trade for another load of life-saving produce. They brought him tools, cloth, oil for a lamp, and books. They saw the elegant simplicity of his systems, the ventilation, the light shaft, the tiered garden beds. Their scorn had been replaced by a profound, humbled respect. They saw that his foolish notions were, in fact, a form of genius. One day, among the group that came to the mill, was his father. Garrett looked older, diminished. The arrogance had been stripped from him by the harsh reality of the blizzard and the humbling news of his son's success. He stood at the entrance to the tunnel, hesitating, while the other men moved past him to load the sled. He looked at Finn, his eyes filled with a complicated mixture of shame, pride, and confusion. He saw the world his son had built, a world born from the very knowledge he had tried to crush. The evidence of his failure as a father was undeniable and overwhelming. He opened his mouth to speak, the words catching in his throat. He began, then stopped. What could he say? I was wrong? I'm sorry? The words were too small for the chasm between them. Finn simply looked at him, his expression unreadable. He felt no anger, no desire for revenge. That had been burned out of him by the cold and the solitude. He felt only a great, weary distance. He waited for his father to speak, but the man seemed unable to form the words. Finally, Finn spoke, his voice quiet but firm. The price is the same for everyone, he repeated, the words not an accusation, but a simple statement of fact. He turned and picked up a basket of carrots, holding it out. Garrett flinched as if struck. The transactional nature of the offer was a more profound judgment than any curse. It meant that the bond between them was broken, replaced by the cold, clean logic of the marketplace. He was no longer a father seeking forgiveness, but just another customer. He slowly took the basket, his hand trembling slightly. He didn't meet his son's eyes. Without another word, he turned and walked back into the storm, a stranger carrying a basket of his son's impossible harvest. When the great thaw finally came, melting the mountains of snow and turning the world to mud, the story of Finn and his underground home had become a legend. He was no longer the strange boy, the outcast. He was the savior of redemption, the man who had understood the earth in a way no one else had. But he did not seek a place in the town. He remained at his mill, in the quiet, stable world he had built. His life did not change dramatically, but the world's perception of him had been irrevocably altered. People no longer came to him out of desperation, but out of curiosity and respect. They came to learn. Farmers who had struggled for years with the harsh climate came to see his subterranean garden, to understand the principles of thermal mass and passive light. Finn, who had once been an outcast for his quiet knowledge, now became a teacher. He shared what he knew freely, not in lectures, but in simple, practical demonstrations. He showed them how to read the land, how to find the stable places, how to dig into the earth not as a grave, but as a womb. He taught them that the solution to the wind and the cold was not to build higher walls, but to go deeper. Over the next few years, the architecture of redemption began to change. Families began to build deep, stone-lined cellars, connected to their homes, with small, angled shafts for light. They began to grow winter gardens, small pockets of green that provided sustenance and hope through the long, dark months. The annual scourge of winter sickness became a thing of the past. The community became more resilient, more self-sufficient, their survival tied directly to the knowledge they had once dismissed as foolishness. Finn never reconciled with his father. Garrett sold his homestead and moved away, a man haunted by the ghost of his own pride. Finn remained a quiet, solitary figure, but he was no longer lonely. He was woven into the fabric of the community in a way he had never been before, respected for who he was, not for who his father wanted him to be. His legacy was not a monument of stone or a name on a plaque. It was written in the land itself. It was in the green shoots that pushed up through the soil in the dead of winter, in the warm, secure cellars that dotted the landscape. He had taken the thing that made him an outcast, his deep, intuitive connection to the earth, and turned it into a gift that saved everyone. How many of us carry a form of knowledge that the world around us does not yet understand? What quiet, unconventional wisdom do we nurture in secret, afraid it will be scorned? And what would happen if we stopped fighting the world on its own terms and instead listened to the deeper logic of our own nature? The boy who was cast out for dreaming in the dirt taught his people that the answers we seek are often not in the heavens we pray to, but in the ground we stand upon, waiting patiently for us to finally look down.